There are stories about death that never become stories. They don't get shared, they don't get retold. They stay locked inside notebooks, medical files, personal journals written late at night and never opened again, not because they are supernatural, but because they are uncomfortable to remember. What you're about to hear are 3 real reports written by people who were present during the hours after someone had already died. None of them were meant to be frightening. They were written simply because someone felt the need to document what happened, and that's exactly why they feel so disturbing. The first report comes from a hospital. The entry is brief, clinical, emotionless. 142, patient pronounced dead, remained in the room for observation. Nothing unusual about that line. Hospitals record deaths every day. But what follows is what stands out to those who've read hundreds of similar files. 0215. The room feels different. Unusual silence. Difficult to describe. No medical explanation follows. No technical observation. The nurse doesn't write about the body. She doesn't mention temperature, color, or physical changes. She writes about the room. Years later, in an informal conversation, she admitted that after that night she avoided staying alone in that room during late hours. Not because she believed something was there, but because, as she described it, the air felt heavier than it should. She continued working in that hospital for years. She just never felt comfortable in that space again. The second report doesn't come from a hospital. It was found inside a personal notebook, years later, among family belongings. A middle-aged man had died at home. The death was expected. No violence, no emergency. While waiting for the necessary procedures, his wife remained alone in the living room. She wrote down the time, then a single sentence. It's been 2 hours. The house doesn't sound the same. She doesn't describe strange noises, nothing moving, nothing visible. She writes about the silence, as if it had changed its shape, as if the house itself was listening. On another page, written about 40 minutes later, there is only one line. I can't sit in the same place anymore. No explanation, no added detail. The notebook ends there. Family members later said that after that night, she never stayed alone in the house after dark. The third report comes from someone experienced, a professional who had dealt with death for decades, someone familiar with procedures, schedules, and loss. The note was written after a death in a long-term care facility. Everything had occurred as expected, but in the final entry, written almost 3 hours later, he added something that wasn't required. I avoided remaining alone in the area after this period, not out of superstition, only intuition. No technical reasoning, no conclusion, just the decision. Years later, when asked about it, he said nothing unusual had happened, nothing visible, nothing that could be clearly pointed out. But during that specific interval, something felt finished, but not fully gone. These 3 reports share something important. None of them mention ghosts. None describe anything impossible. They describe perception, atmosphere, a moment where the body is no longer alive, but the absence hasn't settled yet. And perhaps the most unsettling part isn't what happens to the dead. It's what happens to those who remain. Stay with me, because in the next part, we'll look at the details these reports avoid writing down, and why this specific time window is the hardest to forget. There's something these reports have in common that rarely gets discussed. Not the setting, not the profession of who wrote them, but what they chose not to describe. In all 3 cases, the notes become shorter as time passes. Language tightens. Details disappear. It's as if the longer they stayed in that space, the harder it became to put words on what they were feeling. Researchers who analyze post-mortem documentation often notice this pattern. Not fear, not panic, but avoidance. People don't stop writing because nothing is happening. They stop because writing would force them to acknowledge something they don't fully understand. During the second and third hours after death, the environment often becomes the focus, not the body, not the cause, the room, the house, the silence. Professionals describe it as a shift, not physical, but perceptual, a moment where routine breaks down. One nurse described it as the point where the room stops feeling like a room. Another called it a pause that lasts too long. They don't mean anything supernatural. They mean absence becoming noticeable. Human brains are wired to detect presence, movement, breathing, microsounds we don't consciously register. When those disappear, the brain doesn't relax, it searches. That search creates discomfort, and in spaces where someone has just died, that discomfort has nowhere to go. That's why so many of these reports mention intuition, not belief, not fear, just a decision. I didn't stay alone. I moved to another room. I waited in the hallway. Not because they thought something would happen, but because staying felt wrong. In one follow-up interview, a caregiver admitted something quietly. She said that during that specific window, a few hours after death, she felt watched, not by someone, by the space itself. She immediately corrected herself. She laughed. She said it sounded ridiculous, but she still never stayed alone during that time again. Psychologists suggest this may be the mind adjusting to sudden absence, a recalibration, but even they admit something interesting. The effect doesn't always fade quickly. Some people remember those hours more clearly than the death itself, not because of what they saw, but because of what they felt unable to explain. That may be why these reports remain hidden, filed away, never turned into stories. They don't offer answers, they don't resolve. They sit in that uncomfortable space between logic and experience, between nothing happened and something changed. And maybe that's the most unsettling truth of all, that death doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it lingers quietly, not in the body, but in the room, in the silence, in the way people choose to leave sooner than planned. So the next time you hear someone say, "Nothing happens after death," remember this: for those who stay behind, the hours immediately after are often the hardest to forget. Not because of what they saw, but because of what they couldn't put into words.